To the world, Elias Vance was a ghost haunting the edge of a forgotten Louisiana bayou, and the half-sunk fishing boat listing in the mud was his tombstone. To anyone else, the rotten wood and rusted metal were worthless, a final monument to failure. But his dog, General, a German shepherd with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 loyal lifetimes, knew differently. General knew the derelict vessel held a $200 million secret rooted in betrayal and blood, a secret that had already killed 2 men and would stop at nothing to kill a third. He knew that inside the decaying hull lay the key not only to Elias's salvation but to a truth so profound it could shatter empires built on lies. A truth that could get them both killed long before the sun rose again. If you believe that the deepest wounds can be healed and that loyalty is a force more powerful than greed, please support us by subscribing to our channel. We are a small team, and your support means everything. We'd also love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're in. We are honored to share these stories with you. The ghosts came at night. They always came at night. They wore the face of Sergeant Marcus Thorne, his best friend, his brother in all but blood. They whispered in the dust-dry dialect of a Kandahar valley. Their voices carried on a wind that smelled of cordite and regret. Elias Vance would wake up with his heart trying to hammer its way out of his chest. The sheets twisted around him like a shroud, the stale air of his FEMA trailer thick with the metallic tang of old fear. He'd reach for the bottle of cheap whiskey on the floor, its amber glow the only warmth in his world, but a low growl would stop him. General. The dog would be sitting by the bed, a dark, silent sentinel, his head cocked, his amber eyes fixed on Elias. He wouldn't bark, wouldn't move, just hold his master in that steady, unwavering gaze. It was a look that said, "Not this time. Not again." Elias would sigh, the fire in his throat turning to ash, and the ghost of Marcus would retreat. For now. This was their ritual, the penance and the pardon that defined his life after the army. For 3 years, the world had shrunk to the confines of this rusting trailer and the unwavering loyalty of the dog he'd rescued, or who, more accurately, had rescued him. Then the ritual changed. General became restless. It started with a low whine at the door in the mornings, an insistent nudging of his head against Elias's hand. Soon, he began to disappear for hours, returning soaked in brackish water and smelling of swamp mud. His paws raw. Elias worried, scolded, even chained him once, a decision that earned him a look of such profound betrayal from the dog that he couldn't bear to do it again. One sweltering afternoon, General returned with a deep, clean gash on his shoulder, his coat matted with blood. He limped to the door, looked back at Elias, and let out a single, commanding bark before turning and trotting back toward the swamp, his injured gait a clear and desperate summons. Elias's heart seized. He grabbed a worn medkit and followed without a second thought. General led him away from the familiar dirt tracks, deep into the cypress maze where the air grew thick and still, and the water was the color of black tea. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing down, silencing everything but the buzz of insects and the squelch of his boots in the mud. He pushed through curtains of Spanish moss that clung to him like cobwebs, his concern for General overriding the deep-seated lethargy that had claimed his life. After nearly a mile, the trees thinned, opening onto a hidden inlet, a pocket of water the rest of the world had forgotten. And there, half swallowed by the mud and tangled in mangrove roots, was a boat. It was an old trawler, maybe 40 feet, its white paint peeled away to reveal gray, weathered wood beneath. Its name was still faintly visible on the transom, a cruel irony painted in faded blue letters, Serenity. General stood on the crumbling dock beside it, waiting, his tail giving a single tired thump. The message was clear. Here, this is it. Elias looked from the wounded dog to the broken boat, and for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of something other than grief. Felt like purpose. The first task was to reclaim the Serenity from the swamp's greedy embrace. For 2 days, Elias worked with a feverish intensity he hadn't felt since his last tour. He used a hand-cranked winch anchored to a thick cypress, the cable groaning in protest as he slowly, inch by agonizing inch, pulled the boat's listing hull from the mud. The sound of snapping roots was like bones breaking. Sweat poured down his back, stinging the ever-present sunburn on his neck. General lay on the dock, watching, his wound cleaned and bandaged, his presence a silent, constant encouragement. Once the boat was free, the real work began. The bilge was full of a foul-smelling soup of stagnant water, algae, and dead leaves. Elias bailed it out with a bucket, a Sisyphean task that left his muscles screaming and his hands blistered. Each bucketful heaved over the side felt like purging a part of his own stagnant soul. The boat, like him, was drowning in its own past. As he cleared the water, he began to see the true state of the vessel. It was a wreck, but it had been loved once. The trim was mahogany, now warped and blackened, but the craftsmanship was evident. The brass fittings were tarnished but solid. Below deck, in the cramped cabin, a fine layer of silt covered everything. A small galley kitchen, a navigator station littered with waterlogged charts, a small bunk. It smelled of decay and time. Yet through it all, General remained fixated on one particular spot. In the galley, next to a rusted, pot-bellied stove, he would sit and stare, occasionally letting out a low whine and scratching at the wooden wall with a front paw. The wood there was darker, a patch of mismatched planking that Elias had assumed was a previous owner's clumsy repair. "There's nothing there, boy," Elias would murmur, trying to coax him away, but the dog was adamant. His insistence was a quiet, unyielding pressure. Finally, after a week of cleaning and assessing the damage, Elias gave in to the dog's strange obsession. He grabbed a pry bar, the cool metal a familiar weight in his hand. "All right, you win," he said, more to himself than to the dog. He wedged the tip of the bar into the seam of the mismatched wood. It resisted, then gave with a splintering groan. As he pulled the panel away, the smell of old paper and canvas filled the small space. Tucked deep inside the wall's insulation, wrapped in a thick, oilskin cloth, was a small, rectangular package. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His hands, steady enough to field strip a rifle in the dark, trembled slightly as he reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the small galley table, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the grime on the porthole. General sat at his feet, resting his head on Elias's knee, and let out a soft sigh, as if a long and heavy duty had finally been fulfilled. The boat was no longer just a project. It was a mystery, and Elias Vance, a man who had been running from his own history, found himself on the precipice of uncovering someone else's. He carefully unwrapped the oilskin, revealing a worn leather journal and a single, intricately designed brass key, its surface green with age. The weight of it in his palm felt less like an object and more like a responsibility. The journal's leather cover was stiff and warped, its pages swollen from years of dampness. Elias handled it with a reverence he hadn't felt in years, carefully prying the pages apart. The ink was faded but legible, written in a tight, precise script. The first dozen pages were exactly what one would expect from a fisherman's log. Notations on tides, weather patterns, fish counts, and musings on the quiet solitude of the bayou. The author, a man named Thomas Reed, seemed to find a profound peace on the water. But as Elias read deeper, the tone shifted. The simple observations became laced with something else. An undercurrent of paranoia, of fear. Reed began writing in code. Phrases about fishing nets and engine trouble were interspersed with celestial navigation data that made no sense for coastal Louisiana. He wrote of a serpent in the garden, a man with a charming smile and a hollow heart who was buying up the soul of the coast. He mentioned shadow ledgers and ghost shipments. Elias felt a dormant part of his mind click into place. It was a book cipher, a variation on a system used by field agents. The celestial data wasn't for navigation. It was the key. Each star chart corresponded to a page number, a line, and a word in a specific book. But which book? He searched the cabin, but the few books on the shelf were waterlogged and useless. The answer, he realized, had to be in the journal itself. He studied the coded entries again, his ranger training in pattern recognition taking over. The fog of grief and whiskey that had clouded his thoughts for 3 years began to dissipate, replaced by the sharp, crystalline focus of a mission. He noticed Reed's repeated references to a single Bible verse, Isaiah 42 verse 16. I will lead the blind by ways they have not known. Along unfamiliar paths I will guide them. I will turn the darkness into light before them and make the rough places smooth. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. In the small town of Port Jude, a 20-minute drive away, he found a dusty used bookstore and bought a King James Bible. Back on the Serenity, with the setting sun casting long shadows through the cypress trees, he began the painstaking work of decryption. Star Chart Alpha corresponded to page 42, line 16, first word. Star Chart Beta, page 42, line 16, second word. It was slow, tedious work. Word by painstaking word, a new narrative emerged from the pages of the old one. It was the story of an investigative journalist who had stumbled upon a massive criminal enterprise. Thomas Reed hadn't been a simple fisherman. He had been in hiding. The serpent was a man named Arthur Sterling, the head of a private military contractor called Aegis Solutions, who was using a legitimate maritime shipping company as a front for smuggling weapons and laundering money. Reed had evidence, but he knew Sterling was ruthless. He had turned his boat into a vault, hiding the pieces of his investigation throughout its structure, leaving this journal as the map. The final sentence of the first decrypted passage sent a chill down Elias's spine. He deals in death, and the cost is always paid by better men. They don't know their lives were sold for profit. The mission was no longer about restoring a boat or even solving a stranger's mystery. It was about justice for those better men. The brass key felt heavier now, and as Elias looked at its intricate design, he knew it was the first of many locks he would have to open. He had found his unfamiliar path, and it was leading him out of the darkness. The changing of the seasons mirrored the transformation of the man and his boat. Summer's oppressive heat gave way to the crisp clarity of autumn. The Serenity, once a skeleton half buried in a muddy grave, began to breathe again. Elias worked from sunrise to sunset, his body falling into a rhythm that was both punishing and purifying. He stripped the hull down to the bare wood, the act of sanding away decades of rot and decay feeling like an exfoliation of his own soul. He learned the art of steam-bending oak ribs to replace the ones that had shattered, the hiss of the steam box a constant companion to the chirping of crickets. He sealed the hull with pitch and tar, his hands and arms perpetually stained black, a physical manifestation of the grime he was working through. The nightmares of Kandahar still came, but they were different now. The ghosts were quieter, their edges softened by the exhaustion of honest labor. Marcus's face in his dreams seemed less accusatory, more watchful. To complete the restoration, Elias needed supplies he couldn't salvage or fashion himself. This forced him out of his self-imposed exile and into the small, tight-knit community of Port Jude. His first few trips were stiff and awkward. He was a ghost in town, too, a tall, silent black man who bought marine epoxy and brass screws, paid in cash and spoke only when necessary. The locals watched him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. But his quiet consistency began to wear down their reserve. They saw the calluses on his hands, the focus in his eyes. They saw a man at work, and that was a language they understood. He found himself spending time at the town's marina, run by a wiry, sun-weathered old Cajun named Sal. Sal had eyes that had seen 70 years of hurricanes and heartaches, and he missed nothing. He remembered the Serenity. "Dat was Tom Reed's boat," he said one afternoon, his voice a gravelly rumble as he watched Elias inspect a new set of cleats. "Quiet fella. Used to be some hotshot reporter up in the city. Came down here to get away from it all," he said. Sal spat a stream of tobacco juice into the water. "Always said the world was full of sharks, and he was tired of swimming with 'em. One day he just vanished. Took his car, left the boat. Folks figured he just moved on. But a man don't leave a boat like dat unless he's running from something awful." Sal's words hung in the air, confirming the danger Elias already felt. He wasn't just restoring a boat. He was excavating a crime scene. His interactions in town, though brief, were a double-edged sword. They provided him with necessary supplies and a sliver of human connection he hadn't realized he craved. But they also made him visible. He was no longer just a ghost in the bayou. He was the man fixing up the old reed boat. His work was becoming known. And while the town saw a simple restoration, Elias knew he was reassembling a weapon, a vessel of truth that had been scuttled to keep it silent. He was making it seaworthy again, and he had no doubt that the sharks Tom Reed had been running from were still circling in the water. One afternoon, as he was fitting a new pane of glass into the cabin's main window, he saw a glint of light on the road that led to his secluded patch of land. It was the sun reflecting off the windshield of a car, a sleek, black sedan that looked profoundly out of place against the backdrop of cypress and swamp. It drove slowly, then stopped. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He put his hand on General's head, and the dog let out a growl so low it was more of a vibration than a sound. They had been found. The man who stepped out of the black sedan was the physical opposite of the bayou. He wore a crisp, tailored linen suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty ground. He was handsome in a severe, corporate way, with silvering hair swept back from his temples and a smile that was perfectly calibrated for disarming charm. He moved with an athlete's grace, his eyes scanning the restored boat, the neat stacks of lumber, the organized tools with an appraising glint. "Quite the impressive project," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. He extended a hand. "Arthur Sterling. My firm is acquiring some of the surrounding land for a new eco-resort development." Elias didn't take the offered hand. He simply nodded, his own hand stained with wood varnish, a stark contrast to Sterling's manicured perfection. General remained at his side, a low, continuous rumble in his chest. The dog's hackles were raised. "I'm Elias Vance," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Sterling's smile never wavered, but his eyes were cold, analytical. They lingered on Elias's face, on the faded tribal tattoo peeking out from his sleeve. "A veteran? Army, I'd guess. Rangers, by the look of you. Men like you know the value of hard work." He gestured toward the Serenity. "I admire what you've done here. You've brought this old girl back from the dead. That's why I came to you personally. My company, Sterling Maritime Properties, is consolidating the waterfront plots. This one and the boat are the last pieces of the puzzle. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. Enough to buy a new boat, a new house, and start over somewhere fresh. Cash. No questions asked." The offer hung in the humid air, slick and tempting. It was a lifeline, an easy way out. 3 years ago, Elias would have taken it without a second thought. But he wasn't that man anymore. This boat was more than wood and brass to him. It was Tom Reed's legacy. It was the tomb of men he'd never known. And somehow it was his own path to absolution. "She's not for sale," Elias said evenly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire journey. Sterling's mask of affability slipped for just a moment. A flicker of something hard and dangerous crossed his face before being replaced by a look of disappointed concern. "Mr. Vance, I urge you to reconsider," he said, his tone shifting, a silken threat woven into the politeness. "This is a volatile area, prone to accidents, fires, storms. It would be a terrible shame if all your hard work were to be undone overnight by some unforeseen tragedy." He glanced at General, whose growl had become more pronounced. "A fine dog. It's important to protect the things we care about." Sterling gave a final, tight smile, slid back into his air-conditioned car, and was gone, leaving behind only the scent of expensive cologne and the quiet menace of his words. Elias stood on the dock for a long time, his hand resting on General's powerful neck. The serpent had just introduced himself. The coded warnings in the journal were no longer abstract. They had a name and a face. The fight Tom Reed had run from had just arrived on his doorstep. The threat did not take long to materialize. 3 nights after Sterling's visit, Elias was jolted from a shallow sleep by General's frantic, explosive barking. It wasn't the dog's usual warning growl. This was a sound of pure alarm. Elias was out of his bunk in an instant, his senses on high alert. Something was wrong. The boat was moving. Not the gentle rocking of the tide, but a slow, deliberate drift. He scrambled onto the deck. The air was cool and moonless, the water a black mirror. In the faint starlight, he saw the problem immediately. The thick mooring lines that secured the Serenity to the dock had been cut, their frayed ends dangling uselessly in the water. The boat was being carried by the current out of the sheltered inlet and into the main shipping channel. In the distance, he saw the lights of a massive barge, its deep horn sounding a mournful warning as it churned its way upriver. They were on a collision course. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold, but his training slammed it back down. Assess. Prioritize. The engine. He'd spent the last month painstakingly rebuilding the boat's old diesel engine, but he hadn't tested it under load yet. There was no choice. He slid into the small wheelhouse, his hands flying across the controls by feel. He cranked the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed a plume of black smoke, then fell silent. "Come on! Come on!" he gritted out, trying it again. Nothing. The barge was closer now, a mountain of steel gliding through the darkness. He could hear the thrum of its powerful engines vibrating through his own hull. He tried the ignition a third time, whispering a prayer to whatever god might be listening. The engine caught. With a deafening roar, the old diesel shuddered to life. Elias threw the throttle forward, and the Serenity lurched, her propeller churning the dark water. He managed to steer her out of the barge's path with only seconds to spare, the massive vessel's wake tossing them violently. Shaking with adrenaline, he guided the Serenity back to the dock and secured it with emergency lines. It was a clear message from Sterling. "I can destroy you." The next morning, fueled by coffee and cold fury, Elias returned to the journal. The first cipher had led him to a general understanding of Reed's investigation. Now he needed specifics. He needed the next key. The journal spoke of a captain's treasure, kept safe from the storm's fury. He thought of the brass key he'd already found. It didn't fit any of the boat's visible locks. He searched the captain's bunk again, running his hands over every inch of the wooden frame. His fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation on the underside. Pressing it, he heard a faint click. A small, hidden drawer slid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a lock. He inserted the brass key. It turned smoothly, unlocking a hidden compartment beneath. Within lay a single microcassette tape and a small, waterproof cylinder. Elias's hands trembled as he held the tape. This was it. This was the heart of the secret. He found an old Walkman at a pawn shop in town, the purchase earning him a curious look from the owner. Back in the safety of the Serenity's cabin, with General standing guard at the door, he inserted the tape, put on the headphones, and pressed play. The voice that filled his ears was strained, laced with the quiet terror of a man who knew he was running out of time. It was Thomas Reed. "If you're hearing this," the voice began, "then I'm already gone. His name is Arthur Sterling. His company is Aegis Solutions. They're not just smugglers. They sell intelligence. Bad intelligence. They sell American lives to the highest bidder." The world tilted on its axis. Elias listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the small plastic player. Reed's voice, thin and reedy through the cheap headphones, laid out the entire conspiracy. He spoke of falsified threat assessments of patrol routes sold to insurgents of compromised assets. He explained how Sterling's company, Aegis Solutions, would secure lucrative government contracts to provide intelligence and logistical support in war zones, only to cut corners and betray their clients for a higher profit margin from a third party. Reed had sources, documents, a ledger. He had it all. And then he said the words that stopped Elias's heart. "The worst I found, a deal made in the Kandahar province. They called it Operation Desert Scythe. Aegis provided faulty satellite intel to a Ranger unit, leading them directly into a kill box. They sold them out for a pittance, a side deal to secure a lithium mining contract. There was one casualty listed in the initial report." Reed's voice wavered as he shuffled papers. "Here it is. Sergeant Marcus Thorne. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Marcus. The headphones slipped from his ears, clattering onto the table. The quiet cabin of the Serenity dissolved, replaced by the searing sun and choking dust of that valley. He was there again. The crackle of the radio. The bad coordinates. Marcus, his spotter 20 yards ahead, turning back to give him a thumbs up, his grin wide and confident. And then the world erupting in fire and thunder. The ambush, the chaos, the years of guilt, the endless nights spent wondering what he had done wrong, what detail he had missed, how he had failed his friend. It wasn't his failure. It was a betrayal. It was a business transaction. Marcus hadn't died in the fog of war. He had been murdered for a mining contract. The grief that had been a dull, constant ache for 3 years now sharpened into a blade of pure, incandescent rage. Arthur Sterling hadn't just orchestrated a tragedy. He had orchestrated his tragedy. He had taken the most important person in Elias's life and turned his death into a number on a balance sheet. This was no longer about a stranger's justice. It wasn't about redemption. It was about retribution. The ghosts of the past were no longer whispering. They were screaming for a reckoning. And Elias Vance was finally ready to answer. The rage was afire, but Elias had been trained to bank fires like that, to turn the heat into focused energy. His first instinct was to take the tape and the other evidence from the waterproof cylinder, an encrypted flash drive containing the shadow ledgers, and drive to the nearest federal building. But he immediately dismissed the thought. Sterling was not a common criminal. He was a man with immense power, wealth, and connections. He would have eyes and ears everywhere. Handing the evidence over to the wrong person would be a death sentence, and the proof would be buried forever. Sterling would expect him to run or to go to the authorities. Elias would do neither. He would make his stand here. The Serenity had been Tom Reed's sanctuary and his tomb. Now it would be Elias's fortress. The battle would be fought on his own terms, on his own ground. He made a choice. He spent 2 days in a public library in a neighboring parish, using their computers to make encrypted, anonymous copies of the flash drive's contents. He sent one to a secure Dropbox maintained by a major international newspaper and another to a trusted contact from his old unit, a man who now worked high up in the intelligence community with a simple 2-word message: Desert Scythe. It was his insurance policy. If he failed, if he died, the truth would still come out. With his fail-safe in place, he returned to the bayou and began to prepare for war. The restoration of the Serenity shifted from an act of healing to one of tactical fortification. His ranger skills, long dormant and a source of so much pain, now became his greatest asset. He saw the boat not as a home but as a battlefield. He knew its every creak, its every shadow. He rewired the boat's electrical system, creating a separate circuit he could control from a hidden switch in the wheelhouse, allowing him to plunge the deck into total darkness while keeping the cabin lights on, blinding anyone outside. He worked on the old diesel engine not just to make it run but to weaponize it. A specific valve, if opened, would vent a massive cloud of scalding, opaque steam across the entire stern. He loosened the bolts on a section of the portside railing, just enough so that it would hold its own weight but would give way under the force of a man's body. He arranged coils of heavy rope in the shadows of the foredeck, perfect for tangling the feet of an unsuspecting intruder. He was turning this vessel of peace into a trap, using the very tools of its restoration, the ropes, the cleats, the heavy oak planks, as implements of defense. General seemed to understand the shift in atmosphere. The dog was no longer a calm companion but a vigilant partner. He patrolled the deck with a quiet, deadly seriousness, his ears constantly swiveling, tasting the air for any unfamiliar scent. During this time, Elias found the final piece of Tom Reed's puzzle. The decrypted journal led him to a false bottom in a water tank, where Reed had hidden his most personal effects. A small box containing photographs of a smiling woman and a young boy, and a final, handwritten letter. It was a farewell to his family, explaining that he had to disappear to protect them from Sterling, a man he called a cancer on the soul of the country. Reading it, Elias felt a profound connection to the dead journalist. They were two men from different worlds, haunted by the same demon, fighting for the memories of those they loved. He carefully resealed the box and promised the ghost of Tom Reed that he would finish the fight. He cleaned his tools, oiled the engine, and waited. He knew Sterling would not let the loose end of the Serenity dangle for long. He would come. The storm rolled in from the Gulf, a bruised purple wall of clouds that swallowed the setting sun. The wind picked up, whipping through the cypress trees with a low, mournful howl. Rain began to fall, first as a whisper, then as a driving torrent that lashed the deck of the Serenity and turned the bayou into a churning cauldron. It was the perfect night for violence. Elias sat in the darkened wheelhouse, a mug of black coffee in his hands, watching the road. General lay at his feet, utterly still, a coiled spring of muscle and instinct. Around 10 o'clock, a pair of headlights cut through the deluge. A heavy-duty truck, not Sterling's sedan. It parked, and two large, shadowy figures emerged, dressed in dark rain gear. They moved with a purpose that told Elias they weren't here to talk. He gave General a quiet command, and the dog slipped out of the wheelhouse, melting into the shadows near the bow. Elias watched the men approach the dock. They carried heavy flashlights and something else, bolt cutters. They weren't here to threaten. They were here to finish the job, to sink the Serenity and its secrets for good. As the first man stepped onto the deck, Elias hit the hidden switch. The deck lights instantly went out, plunging the boat into near-total darkness, while the main cabin light remained on, backlighting the two men and ruining their night vision. They cursed, momentarily blinded. In that instant of confusion, Elias moved. He swung a heavy, coiled rope like a lasso, catching the second man around the ankles and pulling sharply. The man went down hard, his head hitting the deck with a sickening crack. The first man spun around, raising a heavy tire iron. Elias was already closing the distance. He didn't use fists, he used the environment. He ducked under the wild swing, grabbed a nearby fishing gaff, and hooked the man's rain jacket, using his own momentum to spin him off balance and send him crashing into the weakened portside railing. The wood splintered, and the man yelled in surprise as he tumbled over the side into the churning, dark water. Just then, a third figure appeared on the dock, silhouetted by the truck's headlights. It was Sterling, his expensive suit now protected by a long black coat. He held a pistol, its form sleek and deadly in the rain. "Vance?" he shouted over the wind. "You're a harder man to kill than I thought. Give me the drive, and I might let you and the dog live." Elias stood his ground in the wheelhouse doorway. "It's over, Sterling. The story is out." Sterling laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Nothing is over until I say it is. I've built an empire by burying men like you and Reed. You're just one more ghost." He raised the pistol, but before he could fire, Elias threw the valve for the engine's steam vent. A massive, screaming cloud of white-hot steam erupted from the stern, engulfing the deck in a thick, blinding fog. Sterling staggered back, disoriented. Elias used the cover to move, circling around the cabin. The final confrontation took place on the slick, rain-lashed foredeck. The two men were blurs of motion in the storm. Sterling was ruthless, but Elias was fighting on his home turf. The fight was brutal and primal. Sterling, enraged, finally managed to land a solid blow, sending Elias sprawling. He stood over him, the pistol aimed at his head, a triumphant sneer on his face. "This is how it ends, soldier. Just like your friend Marcus." At the mention of his friend's name, something inside Elias broke. But before he could react, a black shape launched itself from the shadows. General, silent and swift as the specter of death, slammed into Sterling's side. The dog's jaws clamped down on Sterling's gun arm with ferocious power. Sterling screamed in agony and shock, the pistol flying from his grasp and skittering across the deck. The attack was so sudden, so violent, it gave Elias the 1 second he needed. He surged to his feet, drove his shoulder into Sterling's chest, and brought the man down. The fight was over. With Sterling and his now conscious but subdued thug securely tied with anchor rope, Elias made the call. He didn't dial 911. He dialed the direct number for his old contact, the one who had received the encrypted drive. "It's Vance," he said, the rain dripping from his face. "Operation Desert Scythe. I have a package for you." Less than an hour later, a black, unmarked helicopter descended through the storm, its searchlight cutting a brilliant cone through the rain. Federal agents swarmed the dock, taking a disbelieving and bleeding Arthur Sterling into custody. As they led him away, his eyes met Elias's. The hatred in them was absolute. But Elias felt nothing. Not hatred, not triumph, not even satisfaction. He just felt quiet. He knelt and put his arms around General, burying his face in the dog's wet fur. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good boy." The fall of Arthur Sterling and Aegis Solutions was swift and spectacular. The evidence Elias and Tom Reed had secured was irrefutable. The story broke wide, a scandal of greed and betrayal that shook the foundations of the private military industry. Indictments came down, careers were ended, and for the first time, a light was shone into the darkest corners where war and profit met. The ghosts of the men whose lives had been sold so cheaply finally had a voice. As the man who had brought the truth to light, Elias was named the sole heir to Thomas Reed's estate. The quiet journalist, it turned out, had been independently wealthy, his money held in trust. It was a fortune Elias neither wanted nor felt he deserved. He knew immediately what he had to do. He established the Thornreed Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal aid and advocacy for soldiers and their families who were victims of corporate malfeasance in war zones. It was a legacy built not of stone or brass, but of justice. It gave Marcus's death a meaning beyond tragedy. It turned his sacrifice into a shield for others. The foundation was a way to honor both the friend he had lost and the stranger whose courage had shown him the way back to the world of the living. He kept the serenity. He finished the restoration not as a fortification, but as the home it was always meant to be. The mahogany glowed with a deep, warm luster. The brass shone in the sun. The new engine purred with a steady, reliable rhythm. It was no longer a wreck, no longer a tomb. It was a sanctuary. On a perfect, cloudless morning, with the bayou calm and the air tasting of salt and new beginnings, Elias Vance stood at the helm of the Serenity. General stood beside him on the deck, his noble head raised, the wind gently ruffling his fur. They motored out of the inlet, leaving the dark waters of the swamp behind, and headed for the open sea. The boat cut cleanly through the blue water, a testament to the healing power of patient, honest work. Elias looked at the endless horizon, the ghosts of Kandahar finally silent, replaced by the quiet hum of the engine and the steady presence of the loyal friend at his side. He was no longer a man haunted by the past, but a man sailing toward a future he had earned, a guardian of a legacy of truth, finally at peace, finally serene. This story is a testament to the unwavering power of loyalty and the profound truth that sometimes the path to healing our deepest wounds is found not in forgetting the past, but in restoring its broken pieces to build a better future. Elias Vance, guided by a faithful companion, didn't just rebuild a boat. He rebuilt his own soul, proving that even in the darkest of waters, purpose can be a lighthouse and redemption can be a safe harbor. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story resonated with you, we would be so grateful if you would like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing stories like this to light. Please, tell us in the comments what part of this story moved you the most, or share a story of a loyal companion who changed your life. We read every comment and are honored to be a part of this community with you. Until next time, take care.